Hi, GDG is a very interesting developer community.
I'm glad somebody has asked this question.
This is where the magic happens.
This is primarily a question and answer show. So if any of you out there would like to ask questions.
All right, hi everybody. Welcome to another session of Google App Engine Office Hours. Today I'm going to be walking you through some of the advancements in Google Cloud Endpoints, which many of you may know we announced at Google I/O in June. So for any of you that aren't familiar with endpoints, we'll be giving you a little bit of a summary and a refresher on what that new technology is, and then we're also going to go and show you some of the things that we didn't actually talk about at I/O as well. So I prepared some slides for you, so we'll switch over to those and we'll get started. So the topic today is Google Cloud Endpoints using Java as the backend implementation, JavaScript for actually consuming the endpoints, and some information on how to use both of those, and OAuth 2 as well. So if you're not familiar with Google Cloud Endpoints, as I said, this is a technology we announced at Google I/O. It's a feature of App Engine that allows you to create a scalable API hosted on App Engine that also uses many of the pieces of Google's API infrastructure. So when you're building APIs on Google Cloud Endpoints, you're building them on the same technologies that we use to build Google APIs. So things like the Google Calendar API, the Google Plus APIs, many of the APIs that you're probably already familiar with and already using. And what's great about well, if I get 10 requests a second, can I make that 100 very easily? Yes, you can. So if you saw any of the content that we shared at I/O, whether it was the session that I was participating in or the code labs or some of the other sessions, one of the things that we showed off was a simple tic-tac-toe application that would allow you to power a simple web game or an Android game or an iOS game that let you play tic-tac-toe. And so this is a very simple diagram showing you what the very basic architecture is for that game. So we have a data store which is keeping track of the previous games that you've played. We have that data store being modified by Google App Engine. We have Google Cloud Endpoints as a layer exposing two simple APIs from Google App Engine to a web interface, an Android interface, and an iOS interface. And so you can see here this is what the game might look like. If I click on one of these squares, whoops, accidentally advanced my slides here. Let me see if I can go back. Well, you can still see it. So I click on one of the squares, the computer fills in a move. It's not terribly bright, so it let me win there, but you can see that this is demonstrated that I won at the bottom, and if we scroll down, you can also see, let's see if I can get this back. Just refresh. No, not working. Well, you can still see I can manage to get this to scroll over. There we go. You can see that I've won this particular game and then also tied in a previous game as well. So we'll talk a little bit about some of the details on how this type of system was implemented. So as I mentioned, this is one of the examples that we used at I/O, and this is basically the model that we're storing in the data store that represents the previously played games. So whenever we've finished a game of tic-tac-toe, we're going to save an instance of the score class inside of our data store. And so if you're familiar with Java development on App Engine, one of the implementations that we support for interacting with the data store is called JDO, and this is a really simple JDO class that represents a score. So there's actually nothing custom in this class that's unique to using Google Cloud Endpoints. This is the same type of code that you would write yourself if you were implementing any other type of application in Java on App Engine. So we have a couple properties here. We have a unique identifier that represents the score. We have the player who played the game. We have the outcome of the game, and we have when it was played. And this is also some of the code that we showed you at I/O. This is a really simple endpoint class that implements a tic-tac-toe API. We've cut out some of the methods that do things like get previous scores and list all of the scores to just focus on one of the examples. So in this particular case, we're inserting a new score from a game that we just finished playing into the data store. And so you can see here we have some properties like the name of the API, what version the API is, tic-tac-toe and version 1 respectively. We're giving the API method a name, so this is inserting one of the scores into the data store. And then we have some really simple code to take the score that we've sent to the App Engine backend and persist it for us. So now we're going to talk about some of the new things that we're going to see today and how we can combine this with OAuth 2 and JavaScript to actually implement the front end for this application. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to add another property to the API annotation, and that's for the client ID. So what this is basically doing is it's saying, for any request that's made to this API, I would like to make sure that it is coming from an application represented by whatever client ID I've specified. So if you're not familiar with OAuth 2, a client ID is basically a way of identifying an application. And if you've used any of Google's other APIs, you may have used the APIs console, which is where you would get a client ID for your own application. So in the same way that you would represent your application to Google, you're representing your application when you call Google Cloud Endpoints. So here you can see an example client ID, abc123.apps.googleusercontent.com. You can put multiple values in there if you'd like multiple client IDs or applications to be accessing your APIs. But if it doesn't show up in that list, the requests will obviously not succeed. So the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to say, okay, well, we've said what applications we want these requests to come from, but once we've done that, how do we figure out what user it is that's actually making the request? And doing this inside of an endpoint class is actually really simple. The only thing that we have to really do is add this code here that I'm highlighting. We're adding the user object as a parameter in our invocation to the insert method. So this is the exact same user service that you might have used inside of other App Engine applications. So if you're using a user object somewhere else inside of your code and you use it inside of Google Cloud Endpoints, it's actually exactly the same. So you can see here, we're then setting the score, the player of this particular game, to the user that is sending this request so that we can persist it inside of the data store. And then if you were to use that user object later, if you want to query all of the scores from a particular user, it's exactly the same type of object. If you're doing other types of interactions with the data store outside of Cloud Endpoints, again, it's exactly the same user service that you're already used to using. And then, of course, we're persisting it as we were before. And then for cases where we actually do not have a valid request from a user, we're throwing an OAuth request exception, which will be properly propagated back to any of the clients that are calling these APIs. So if you combine the two of those, this is what the final code would look like for our backend service. You can call it V2 of the tic-tac-toe API that now properly supports OAuth 2 via the user service. So let's move on to how you would implement the front-end code for this in JavaScript. So in the demos that we showed at I/O, we had a really simple example using the Google-provided JavaScript client library. And basically when that loads, we call initialization functions that load up all of the APIs that we're interested in using. So in that particular example, we're only interested in loading the tic-tac-toe API, and this is what the code for that looked like when we showed it off at I/O. Now that we're interested in using OAuth 2, we're going to add another API into that code. And once that API has loaded, we're going to attempt to sign in the user. So you can see here, the API that we're loading is OAuth 2. This is, of course, V2 of OAuth. And then we're calling a sign-in method, which I can show you now as well. Oops. So what this does is it calls a built-in function of the JavaScript client library called Authorize. Takes the client ID for your application. Again, this is the same client ID that you've passed into your backend code. One or more API scopes that you're interested in using, such as the user info.email scope. a mode, and this is, we'll talk about that more in just a second, and then a response type, which type of tokens you're interested in getting back. So the mode here is, there's two configurations that you can use. The first mode is immediate mode, and what that will attempt to do is basically authorize the user without initiating a prompt. So basically that pop-up window that you might be used to seeing won't appear, but this will only work if the user has already previously granted access to your application. You might say, well, let's say the user hasn't granted authorization in the past. Well, we'll get to that in just a second. So here we'll assume that the user has already logged into the application before, so when your page gets loaded, they'll automatically be logged back in again, and then your application can continue. So this is basically what the callback function would look like once the user has authorized. We're going to basically make a request here to get information about the user, such as the user's email address, properly save the token, and then we can call our endpoints. And then finally, to handle the case where the user has never authorized the application before, we'll add a little bit of code to our UI, like a sign-in button. And when that button is clicked, we'll call a method, such as auth here, which will call that authorized method again without using immediate mode. And then we'll pass that through to the same callback method that we used previously. So the best part about this is that it's relatively simple to add OAuth 2 to your implementations of your clients. So in the JavaScript client, like we showed here, but the actual code to call the APIs hasn't changed at all. So this is exactly the same code that we used in the demos at I/O to insert a new score into the data store. And all of the pieces around OAuth 2 have basically just been transparently added in the background of all of these requests. So there's nothing special that we need to do once we're actually writing our code that makes sure that OAuth 2 continues to work. All that's handled just a single time right up front. So hopefully you found this demo interesting. If you haven't already signed up for the Trusted Tester program for Google Cloud Endpoints, there's a link to that here. We'll provide a link to these slides in the information about this Hangout. We also have a link to the code lab, which I also showed at I/O, so you can follow through the complete development of a Java backend. And then I have a link to the little iframe demo that I showed earlier in the slides if you'd like to play tic-tac-toe yourself. And then you can also inspect the entire source code of the front end of the application, so all of the JavaScript that's powering that demo. And with that, I think we're done with slides, and I think we have some questions on the moderator that we can go through.
Can you hear me, Dan?
Yes, I can hear you.
Great. Hi, everyone. I'm Amy, another App Engine developer relations. So I'm going to be the moderator question reader. Okay, and so I'm going to start one that I think is most related to this presentation. Some APIs, email settings, require a super user to authenticate. When running the web application, only the end user is authorizing access. How best to intermix that authorization with normal end user authorizations?
So I think that there's really a couple pieces to the answer for this question. So one of those is that on App Engine we have the concept of service accounts, or actually Google APIs have the concept of service accounts, which basically allow you to call an API that's not necessarily representing a request from a user. So a lot of those administrative type of APIs, the requests that they're making, to update some organization-specific information, a lot of the time those are coming from services rather than active users. But then there's also the concept of two-legged OAuth, which I think is maybe more interesting in this case. So something like the email settings API, only an administrator can access that particular API, but they might want to do it on behalf of another user. So let's say the domain administrator for an organization wants to update the email signatures of all the people at their company, they might call the email settings API on behalf of a specific user in order to update those email settings. So without a little bit more detail on what the specific API is that we're trying to call, I don't think we can give a complete answer. But those are two of the technologies that might be useful in that case.
Okay, the next question is a little more general. Is there a way to backup restore data within any Google infrastructure? Not like Google Drive, but much larger, mostly for archiving purposes. If not, is such a service in the plan, or are there other providers? So this is not directly related to Cloud Endpoints. I can take a stab at part of it, and then you can elaborate again.
Sure.
So there's a Free Your Data initiative. I can't remember exactly what that's called, but it's actually a big effort to let you get all of the data that you own out of all the various Google services. Do you remember what that is called exactly, Dan?
Is it called? It might be called Takeout.
It might be. Yeah. So there is something supported like that. Perhaps a little more pertinently to App Engine and other cloud services. Something else that you might investigate is Google Cloud Storage, which is very good for easily archiving and accessing lots of data, and it plays well with BigQuery and Google Compute Engine when that's more widely available, and it's really fast and scalable. So you might check into that. Anything to add?
No, I think that pretty much covers it. I would wonder why they wouldn't consider Drive for archival storage as well. I mean, unless we're talking really huge amounts of data in which maybe the price is not quite suitable for that, but I think it would work there too.
Yeah, that's another. Okay, let's see. There's one that I'm not sure I know how to interpret without some clarification. It says, I know how to loop through all the documents in nest collections, but how would you access all the unresolved comments for each document?
Yeah.
I think we might need a little more context on that one. Sorry. Yeah. And I would encourage people to post questions on Stack Overflow. So since we can't talk to the person directly right now who posted that question, do ask it on Stack Overflow and add a little more detail.
Yeah, definitely. All right, are those the only moderator questions?
Let's see. Yeah, those are the only ones.
All right. Do you have anything to add about Cloud Endpoints?
I don't. That was an excellent presentation, Dan.
Oh, thank you.
And I would encourage everyone to go play with the Code Lab. We'll post the links to the slides, and from there you'll find the Code Lab link. I've played around with it, and it's a ton of fun. It's really great.
Yeah, I should note that the Code Lab doesn't actually require that you're whitelisted until you actually deploy to App Engine. So if you just want to try it out and you say, well, I'm not sure if I want to apply, or you're not sure if you'll get in immediately, you can try out many of the steps, I think up through step 4 of the Code Lab, which is actually fairly significant, even without deploying anything to App Engine. So.
And I'd also add, just because we get this question periodically, people also wonder if Cloud Endpoints are supported in Python. And yes, they are, even though the Code Lab doesn't touch on that.
Right, exactly. And I will hope to share some more information on the Python development environment for endpoints, perhaps in a future Hangout.
Yeah, a future mini tech talklet. So yeah, just for those of you who aren't tuning in on these necessarily every week, we're starting to have a goal of presenting a lot of these little mini tech talks pretty much every week, and then just also take regular App Engine office hour type of questions too. So we hope to give you these little chunks of information every week, hopefully something that's relatively new, maybe that you haven't played around with yet, or don't have much information on yet. So stay tuned.
Yeah. All right, great. Well, if that's all the questions, then thanks everyone for tuning in, and we'll see you all next time.